next panelist will be Dr. Muhammad Khalil, Professor of Islamic Studies at Michigan State University. Muhammad Khalil is an assistant professor of religious studies at Michigan State University. Before returning to his hometown of East Lansing, Professor Khalil was an assistant professor of religion and a visiting professor of law at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. He received all his degrees from U of M Ann Arbor and is the author of Islam and the Fate of Others, The Salvation Question. Dr. Khalil has presented papers at various national and international conferences, has published peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters on Islamic ethics, Western analysis of Islamic theology, the intersection of Islamic historiography, exegesis, and the law. Without further ado, Dr. Muhammad Khalil.
Thank you. Good morning, or is it good afternoon? Have you all received this handout, Introduction to Islamic Law? I hope you all have a copy.
No.
If not, if someone wouldn't mind passing those out, that'd be great. I was asked to speak about Islamic law, and not so much Bill 4769, and so that's what I'll do today. And as a religious studies professor, I have to begin by talking about Islam, because we cannot understand Islamic law without understanding some very basic ideas about Islam itself. So first, there's the term Islam. What does the term Islam mean? After 9/11, there were many Muslims who were saying Islam means peace. Islam means peace. And technically that's true. But that's not the primary meaning of Islam. The primary meaning of Islam is submission to God. And submission seen in a very positive light. And so a Muslim then is one who submits to God. Okay? Now, another term that's very important is Allah. Just as there were Muslims saying Islam means peace, Islam means peace, there were others after 9/11 saying, well, Allah is some kind of foreign god, some kind of Arabian pagan deity, and that this is a very foreign religion. It has nothing to do with the Abrahamic traditions. In fact, Allah is simply the Arabic word for God with a capital G. If you were to open up most Arabic Bibles, the kind of Bibles that Arab Christians use, you go to Genesis 1, and you will read, Fil bad'i khalaq Allah, which means in the beginning God created, and the word for God is Allah. In fact, we also have to remember Arabic is a Semitic language. Other Semitic languages are Hebrew and Aramaic. In Hebrew, one of the ways you say God is Elohim. And the rabbi's here to correct me, but the im at the end here is just used to magnify. So if we drop the im, we're left with Eloh. And another term for God that's used in the Hebrew Bible is Eloah. Jesus didn't speak English. Jesus spoke what language? Aramaic. One of the ways that you say God in Aramaic is Allah. In fact, if you watch Mel Gibson's film, The Passion of the Christ, there's a scene where Jesus says Allah, and it's translated as God with a capital G. So we can actually hear, and actually if you know Arabic, you know you could say Allah, depending on where it is in the sentence. Uhibbu Allah, right? So we can see the similarities here. So this is important to clarify. Muhammad, of course, is the most important figure in Islam. He's considered the final prophet in Islam. He's seen as just a human being, though. He is just a human being. In fact, the Quran will often correct him. For example, the 80th chapter of the Quran, the first 10 verses, criticize the prophet for frowning and turning away when a blind man interrupted his meeting with a powerful Meccan leader. But Muhammad is not the only figure in Islam. There are other figures. In fact, he is considered the last of a long line of prophets. Prophets that include Abraham, Noah, Moses, Jesus. Jesus is considered a prophet in Islam. So don't be surprised if you see a Muslim with an I Love Jesus shirt. Okay? Now, Moses actually appears more frequently in the Quran than any other prophet. In fact, Muhammad only appears 4 times in the whole Quran. Moses appears more frequently than anybody else. And Pharaoh is the biggest bad guy, we might say, in the whole Quran. And I say that he is an Egyptian American. Not too happy about that. But anyway, the next term is Sharia. Okay, so this is now we're getting into the Islamic law now. What is Sharia? Sharia can mean many things. First, Sharia can just mean Islamic law in a general sense. Okay, if we think of it that way, then it doesn't make sense to say Sharia law, because then you're saying Islamic law. But anyway, the second understanding of Sharia is the path, the stream, the river, the path that leads you to the source. And what the idea here is that we're thinking, okay, we're talking about God now. So what does God want? What is the law as God would want it? That is what Sharia is. It's the ideal law. But because we're humans and because we are fallible, there is another term that's used called fiqh. Fiqh means understanding. And this is the human attempt to understand God's law. Because, again, we're humans, we're fallible, we don't know what God wants. So there's this term fiqh. And the general idea here is, okay, if there is no consensus, we will agree to disagree. In fact, in the 4th Islamic century, there was a scholar who compiled a list of all the doctrines Muslims agree on. It was a 166-page document. Another scholar in the same century documented all of the doctrines that Muslims, jurists, disagree on. It was a voluminous work. And I bet you if someone were to do the same thing today, the book of things they agree on would be much smaller, and the books on things they disagree on would fill this entire room. So there's much diversity in Sharia, and this is one of the great myths of Sharia, is that it's some kind of monolith. And so I noticed, for instance, that the proponent of Bill 4769 said that the vast majority of Muslims come to America to escape Sharia. Okay, there are several problems with that, but first let's begin with this issue of Sharia. So when in the media they say, okay, well this country wants to implement Sharia law. Many take that to be the end of the sentence. For me, I want to know what kind of Sharia do they want to implement. You can't find any two Muslim countries that have the same interpretation of Sharia. There's great diversity in Sharia. And so when people say they want to implement Sharia, I want to know what kind of Sharia. What do they have in mind as Sharia? That's the first thing. Now, and then going back to the statement that the vast majority of Muslims came to escape Sharia. First of all, if you're a practicing, believing Muslim, you are going to love Sharia. And you have to remember, interpretations of Sharia vary significantly. You could have a Muslim who says Saudi law is not conservative enough. And you could have a Muslim who says American law is not liberal enough. And they both believe in Sharia. Okay, so this is very important. And then, second of all, the idea that the vast majority of Muslims came here to escape Sharia, even if we assume this is referring to strict interpretations of Sharia, I don't think that's empirically true. I don't think most Muslims come to America to escape strict interpretations of Sharia. I think most come for opportunity and because of political turmoil back in their homeland. Okay, so what are the sources then of Islamic law? Where do Muslims get their law from? It's the jurists especially. Well, first we have the Quran, the Muslim holy book. And what's interesting about the Quran is that even though it's the most important source of law, it actually doesn't have much law in it. There are 6,236 verses in the Quran. Of those verses, there are only 500 to 600 that have anything to do with law. And these are things like prayer, how to wash for prayer. If we think of law like, okay, inheritance laws, family law, all these kinds of things, there are only about 80 verses that deal with that. So there's not much law there. The second major source is the Sunnah. And this is the way of the Prophet Muhammad's normative example, his normative understandings and so on. And here you're going to get much more law. But these, of course, don't fill all the gaps. And so there are other sources or tools that Muslim jurists use. For example, there's consensus. So this is the idea that, if we all agree on something, then we'll assume, and by the way, I have to emphasize that I'm really focusing here on Sunni law, which is the majority interpretation. I'm not an expert on Shi'i law, so I'm not going to say much about Shi'i law. So the next source is consensus. This is the idea that, okay, if we all agree, if all the jurists agree on something, we'll assume that, okay, this is an actual, principle. But this actually, interestingly, leads to more diversity, because if there's no consensus, we agree to disagree. Okay? The second tool is analogy. Okay? So the Quran prohibits wine. It doesn't prohibit crack cocaine. So what do you do now? Well, jurists will use this principle of analogy. Well, if wine's prohibited, then surely crack cocaine would be prohibited. Okay? By the way, it doesn't always work out so neatly. In the 13th, or was it the 16th century, there was a scholar who said that smoking hashish is okay because wine makes you violent. People who smoke hashish are very peaceful. The next thing is public good. So there's this idea that no matter how, when we use this methodology, in the end, the principle, what we arrive with, should be for the sake of the public good. The next item is context. Context, and this is very important. There is this misconception that Sharia is static, that it doesn't change. But, God revealed the law in the Quran, and then it doesn't change after that. And this is really a great misconception. Sharia has always evolved, has always changed, depending on the context. Where you're not going to find much change is when you're dealing with rituals, prayer, fasting, and even then you might find some variation. But when you're dealing with criminal, civil matters, you will find a lot of variation. And actually, even in the 13th century, one of the famous Egyptian jurists, Shihab ad-Din al-Qarafi, he made this very clear. He said, anyone who thinks that you don't use context in your consideration doesn't understand Islamic law is a fool. You always have to look at the context of the Prophet's time and your own context. And even the people who succeeded Muhammad, and we were just talking about this earlier, the second caliph, Omar, suspended some of the punishments that the Prophet had instituted because of the context changing. So this is very important. Now, of course, there are other tools that are used, but I won't mention them for the sake of time. In the end, a jurist uses all of these tools to arrive at a fatwa. Now, unfortunately, this term has been really misunderstood. We think of it as some kind of a death sentence or something along those lines because when in the late 80s, Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa saying that Salman Rushdie should be killed. Well, the fact of the matter is the word fatwa has absolutely nothing to do with death. A fatwa is simply a non-binding, yet legitimizing scholarly opinion. That's all a fatwa is. Okay? And so if you don't accept the authority of the person issuing the fatwa, it doesn't mean it doesn't go anywhere. Okay. Now, with all this in mind, what does Sharia mean to individual Muslims living in the United States of America? First of all, there's a general code of behavior. And here I say think of the 10 Commandments. Don't lie, don't steal, don't commit adultery, right? These kinds of things. Now the Sabbath is not there, but still in the holy day of Islam, which is Friday, Muslims will abstain from working, if they're practicing that is, during the Friday prayer, during that period, but not the entire day. And so there's a kind of general code of behavior. That's what Sharia means for most Muslims at an individual level. Also, there are the 5 pillars of Islam. And these are the declaration of faith, saying that I believe in one God and that Muhammad is his messenger. Praying daily, and then giving alms to those in need, fasting in the month of Ramadan, and if one is able to do a pilgrimage to Mecca. And if you miss any of this, you can get it on Wikipedia, but don't look at Wikipedia for anything else. Actually, I remember one time reading the Wikipedia entry for fasting, and I actually read this. They said you could, if you eat underneath your shirt and nobody sees you, that's okay, which is obviously not true. Obviously not true. Okay. Another thing is dietary guidelines. So there's a concept of halal, just like there's a concept of kosher in Islam. So there are some things that Muslims are supposed to abstain from. Pork being a good example. Beyond that, well, what do you have to abstain from? Well, some Muslims will say, yeah, you have to have meat prepared a certain way. Other Muslims will say, no, not necessarily. I mean, you get these interesting debates. Wine is another issue. That doesn't mean, of course, that anybody who's Muslim actually abstains from these things, but if they're practicing Muslims, they would. Also, family law and inheritance law. So, what is the role of the father? What is the role of the mother? How does inheritance work? And here you find significant variation from more traditional patriarchal models to more egalitarian models. Okay? And of course, this is not unique to Islam. This is something that you'll find in other traditions as well. Now, I'll conclude with this. Some popular misconceptions concerning Sharia. So everything that you see listed there, these are misconceptions. The first is that Sharia is monolithic. I've already addressed this issue. And that it necessarily requires a medieval penal code. So when people think of Sharia, the first thing they think about cutting off hands, stoning adulterers. And really for the individual Muslim, that's not on the radar usually. I mean, for the individual Muslim, it's about praying and not stealing, and when you look at medieval legal manuals, the section on punishments is usually quite brief. The emphasis usually is more on, and actually even the punishments, they were actually often described by the jurists as a way of limiting the power of the state. So the state wouldn't go beyond that. And the burden of evidence was often so difficult to reach that these were almost sort of more theoretical punishments. But in any case, again, this is all related to the state. And this has nothing to do with individual Muslims. For individual Muslims, this is really not an issue. And then also the next part of here is that these are all misconceptions now. That the going opinion in Islamic law is that the attacks on 9/11 were legitimate. But if you look at it, I mean, every major religious authority, I don't want to say every, I have to be careful now, but the overwhelming majority condemned the 9/11 attacks in September of 2001. In fact, even people who don't like America, Yusuf al-Qaradawi the founder of Hamas, Ahmed Yassin. I mean, we could go on and on. People who clearly don't like America, even they thought this was too much. Georgetown University in 2009 published a book of the 500 most influential Muslims in the world. It's kind of a problematic list. They accidentally threw in an Arab Christian in there. And they had the King of Morocco at number 3, which I don't understand. But in any case, if you go down the list, though, you find that these are people who condemned the attacks in September of 2001. There's no Pope in Islam, so that complicates things, of course. But just look at Al-Azhar in Egypt, look at Qum in Iran, go to Deoband in South Asia. Just go to these major institutions, and you will see that most of them condemned the attack in September of 2001. In fact, Qaradawi, arguably the most influential jurist in the world, very controversial, not a fan of the U.S., even he said Americans, Muslims should donate blood to the victims. He said this the day after the attacks. And he even said, because of his understanding of Sharia, that Muslims who are going out to fight in Afghanistan and so on, they have to continue serving in the army. Maybe they should avoid being a combatant, but they have to continue serving their country, because in Islamic law, there's this idea of contracts. And if you are a citizen of a state, you have a contract with the state. And that's a very important principle in Islamic law. So even though Qaradawi is completely opposed to the United States, because of this principle of honoring the contract, he insisted Muslims have to honor the United States, their country. Okay. Other misconceptions. Muslims cannot take non-Muslims as friends and must lie to them as well. This is a big one these days, actually. And people, what they'll use is they'll cite a verse, which is Surah 5, verse 51, and they translate it a certain way so that it looks like, yeah, Muslims can't take Jews and Christians as friends. They forget the fact, very conveniently, that verse 5 of that same chapter says Muslims can share meals with Jews and Christians and can marry Jews and Christians. I mean, and the Quran describes marriage as a relationship of love. So can you imagine this? Hey, honey, I love you, but I can't take you as a friend. I mean, how does that work? Let's go make some babies. I mean, how does that work? And then they must lie to them. So the Quran emphasizes that you have to tell the truth. You have to tell the truth. So some of the Muslims were concerned early on during the lifetime of the Prophet, because they're wondering, okay, if somebody says, are you a Muslim, and they're ready to kill me, can I lie? And the Quran says, yeah, you can lie in that case. Also, that honor killings and other forms of vigilante vengeance are legitimate. That is not the going opinion in Islamic law. And I mean, where to begin? I mean, there's so much there that we could talk about. In fact, and there's also something that's going on here too, and that is, often what's called an honor killing. We don't use that same terminology to refer to domestic violence in this country. There was just in Lansing here, there was a man who killed his wife recently. Is that an honor killing? But no, we call it domestic violence. So the terms here are a little bit nebulous, but in any case, another misconception is that the going view is that a man can physically attack his wife. The going view, even in medieval times, was that you cannot leave a bruise or a lingering pain on your spouse. Now, that's not to say that that their views were completely harmonious with modern views. I mean, for example, scholars have long said you can do a symbolic hit with like a toothbrush or something like that. And that certainly wouldn't match our modern conceptions, right? But in any case, another misconception is that women can be forced into marriage. Even in medieval times, that was not the going view. Women cannot drive. That's clearly a Saudi thing. And actually, that seems like that's going to change. I mean, hopefully that's going to change unless the new king of Saudi Arabia has other plans.